Hey guys, welcome to Telling the Told and Untold. My name is Tshego. As we all know, August is Women's Month, so I've decided to cover gender-based violence cases. If there are any specific cases you would like me to cover, please just let me know down in the comments or in the case suggestion link that I have in the description box. Before we go straight into today's video, I do have to give you guys a couple of content warnings. In this video, we do talk about assault, suicide, and this video is very graphic and gruesome. So if that's something you think you're not interested in watching, then maybe you can watch some of my other videos or just wait for my next upload. Alison Botha was born on the 27th of September 1967 in Port Elizabeth. When she was just 10 years old, her parents got a divorce and she spent her childhood living with both her mother and her brother. She was the head girl at the Collegiate High School for Girls in Port Elizabeth, and growing up she didn't really have any big aspirations or career plans. You know, when you're in school you think maybe you want to be a dentist, a doctor, a lawyer, a graphic designer. She didn't have anything like that she wanted to become specifically. After she matriculated, she studied secretarial for a year as something just to fall back on. It's something her mom encouraged her to do, and afterwards she spent the next 4 years overseas before returning home. Once she came back home, she found a job as an insurance broker. On the 18th of December 1994, Alison was 27 years old and it was the perfect summer's day. Her and a couple of friends spent it on the beach, and afterwards they went back to Alison's place and they ordered pizza, played a couple of games, and as the night came to an end, she offered to drop off one of her friends home and also pick up her laundry from the friend's place. After she did this, she returned home and she noticed that her assigned parking spot had been taken by someone else, so she had to park a bit further than she would have liked, and as soon as she parked the car, she felt a knife against her throat. She then heard a male voice tell her to move to the passenger side or else he would kill her. He then got into the car and promised not to hurt her and just told her that he wanted to use her car for about an hour and then he would be done. Afterwards, he introduced himself as Clinton and just engaged in conversation with Alison, asking her about herself, if she had a boyfriend or not. And Alison noticed that she hadn't locked the car doors, so she could have jumped out, but she wanted to believe the best of the situation and not the worst, so she just stayed there. Clinton then pulled over and another guy jumped into the back seat, and Alison caught this guy's gaze in the rearview mirror, and immediately she knew she wasn't going home. His eyes just looked dark, cold, and just pure evil. They then drove past the last streetlights and straight into darkness, and then Clinton pulled over into this dark wooded area and he looked at Alison and asked, "Are you going to fight?" He then forced Alison to perform oral sex on him, and then he proceeded to do the same to her. And as he was doing this, he asked her questions like, "Do you like it?" and "Does your boyfriend do this to you?" He then gave her a love bite on her neck, kissed her, and then proceeded to rape her. The guy in the back then said Frans Skinner, and it clicked for Alison that he had lied about his name, and his name wasn't Clinton. In fact, it was Frans. Frans then asked the guy, whose name turned out to be Deans, if he wanted to have sex with the lovely lady, and then he said, "No, I want to fuck the bitch." Frans then told Deans that he couldn't speak about Alison like that because she was a lady and deserved to be treated with respect. Next thing, Deans had his hands around Alison's throat and he started stabbing her in the pubic area and stomach an excess of 47 times. After this, he took the knife and slit her throat ear to ear. Then Frans pushed him aside, took the knife and started stabbing her in the neck a total of 17 times. The two men then got into their car, leaving Alison for dead and throwing her clothes out of the window as they drove off. Alison remembers that she wasn't in any pain and she could hear her breathing through her severed windpipe. And this is when she realized that she had been so injured and she wasn't going to make it. The next thing she describes is her having an out-of-body experience where she kind of left her body and she could see herself lying on the floor, and she had to make a decision whether she wanted to live or she wasn't going to go back into her body. And this is when she decided that she was going to fight, and then next thing she knew, she was back in her body. The first thing she wanted to do was make sure that Frans and Tiens were never going to hurt anyone else ever again. So with all her might, she took her finger and in the sand she wrote Frans and Tiens, and under it she wrote, "I love Mom." Next thing she remembers feeling something wet on her legs, and as she looked down she realized that her intestines were hanging out. So with the denim shirt that they had thrown out of the car window, she took it and held it against her stomach, trying to hold her intestines in place. She then started crawling, trying to get to civilization, with one hand holding the denim shirt in place and the other hand on the floor, crawling. And as she was crawling, she went over coal, sand, and pieces of broken glass. And as she was doing this, she realized that she wasn't moving that much, like it didn't make much of a difference, and she really wanted to survive. She didn't want her mom to know what she had went through, or like see her like that, or not know where she was. So after this, she decided that she was going to stand up and start walking instead of crawling. And as soon as she stood up, everything went black. She then took her hand and she took it to her face, and she went to her neck, and she felt that her head had basically been almost decapitated. Her head was hanging backwards in between her shoulder blades. She then took her hand and lifted her head up, and then she was able to see again, and she started walking. And she describes walking to the road almost as though she wasn't the one physically walking, almost like someone carried her and placed her on the road. And as soon as she got onto the road, she just fell down and was just hoping someone would drive by and be able to help her. One car came, and immediately as soon as she heard this car coming, the first thing she thought of was that it was Frans and Tiens coming back, and she knew that if it was them, she wasn't going to make it. She had no energy left in her to fight, and she was so scared, but she couldn't even move at this point. The car kind of came up towards her and then sped off. And then not too long after that, another car came, and they saw Alison in the middle of the road, and they stopped their car, jumped out, and they saw this young girl lying on the floor covered in blood with her head barely hanging on, and she was completely nude. In the car was 20-year-old Tian Ilierad, and he was a veterinary technology student studying at the Technikon in Pretoria, and he was in Port Elizabeth with friends on holiday. As soon as they got out of the car, he took Alison's hand, and she couldn't speak at all, and he looked into her eyes and noticed that they were completely bloodshot, and she just looked completely terrified. They had a sheet in their car, and they managed to cover her body with it, and luckily for them, one of Tien's friends had a cell phone on him, which was so unlikely for someone in the 90s. This is like 1994. It's not like today where everyone literally has a cell phone. So this guy had a cell phone, and they managed to call emergency services. The hospital was literally 15 minutes away from where Alison was, but it took the ambulance 40 minutes to get to them. And as soon as the ambulance got to them, it's almost as though the paramedics took one look at Alison and they decided that she wasn't going to make it. So they kind of just like took their time. They weren't in any rush, because for them it was kind of like, why should we waste our resources on the inevitable? Like, she's not going to make it. And Deon was still holding her hand. They put her into the ambulance and they were driving to the hospital. And he noticed that they weren't like rushing, like they weren't driving fast. They were just taking their time. And he asked them to like speed up, to hurry. But for them, it was just like, what's the point? And they just continued. But eventually they did get to the hospital, and this was the first time Deon let go of Alison's hand, and then she was taken by the doctors. Alison's injuries were so severe. Her neck had been cut from ear to ear, and her trachea windpipe had been cleanly cut through, and she was literally breathing through a gaping hole just above her collarbone. The doctors then discovered that that was not all. They pulled the sheet down and saw that she had been completely disemboweled, and some parts of her small intestine were lying on her tummy. Closer examination showed that it had been contaminated with beach sand, lumps of charcoal, and what looked like lamb chop fat. Then they looked carefully inside her abdomen and saw the extent of her injuries, and they discovered that it was unlikely that she would ever be able to have children. Before going into surgery, Alison somehow managed to sign the consent forms and write down her mom's numbers, and the doctors remember looking at her and like seeing like all her injuries and being so surprised that she was able to hold a pen like with so much steadiness, like it wasn't moving, like it wasn't shaking. It was like nothing was wrong at all. And they just remember looking at her and thinking that this girl was so brave and so strong. The doctors and nurses who worked on Alison called it a miracle, or divine intervention, if you will. The injuries that she sustained didn't make sense. Like, for them, she shouldn't have been alive. She shouldn't have survived, but somehow she did. And like looking at their academics or just like their logic, for them, like none of it made sense. And it even brought so many of them to tears, because for them this was like the impossible, and somehow Alison made it possible. There are blood vessels in the neck that supply blood to the head and brain, and once those muscles are severed, she should have hemorrhaged and died within 3 to 4 minutes. There are also some important nerves that help the organs work, and none of them were damaged. Her esophagus also wasn't damaged, which is like when you swallow food, what it goes down through. Her trachea had been severed, and all the stab wounds to her chest missed her lungs and her heart. And somehow the stab wounds to her abdomen didn't penetrate through to damage any internal organs. Once Alison came out of surgery, a police officer went in to see her and introduced himself as the investigating officer. And with him, he had a file that had pictures of like other criminals, people that have been convicted before of crimes, and he laid it down in front of Alison and he went through it page by page. And then Alison stopped on one picture, pointed at it, and she had a paper and a pen next to her, and on it she wrote France. And then the investigating officer continued going through the file, and then she stopped on another picture, pointed at it, and then on the paper she wrote Deons. The investigating officer knew who France was from a previous rape case. And that same Monday, he found France Detroit as well as Deons Kruger in one of the cells at the murder and robbery unit. I'm not too sure why they were in prison that morning. I'm assuming it's because they had done something, but I don't think it's related to Alison's case, because this was before she had pointed them out. They were already in one of the jail cells for something. So he already knew who they were. But then the chief prosecutor told him that in order for them to have a solid case, she had to verbally say their names. But mind you, Alison had just undergone surgery, like so many surgeries at this point. She couldn't speak. She had a pipe down her throat. Like the most she could do was like write on a piece of paper, you know. And then some police officers went back to the hospital and they told the doctor what the chief prosecutor had said, and he was upset because he was like, now you guys want us to take like this pipe out of her throat that could essentially damage some of the work that they had done throughout those surgeries. So he was so scared that it would kind of like take them a couple of steps back and maybe like something could go wrong. So he went into Alison's room and told her the situation, and she took a piece of paper and she just wrote, "Take it out." And he did as she said. He took out this pipe from her throat, and the first thing she said was, "Wonderful." It was France and Dian's. It turns out that Alison was not France and Dian's first victim. The first victim they had sexually assaulted, and a week later she went to go report them, and it took her this long because she was scared for her life. They had threatened to kill her. The second person they did this to ran out of the building, and as soon as she ran out, she saw a police van and jumped into it and reported what had happened to her. So they told themselves that their third victim they were not going to leave alive, because the other two they had threatened, and even after they had threatened them, they still went to go report them, so they didn't want to deal with that. So that's exactly what they did, but they didn't succeed. The investigating officer first brought Franz into his office and read him his rights, and then told him that he was being arrested for attempted murder. And Franz looked a bit confused and he asked attempted murder, and this is when the investigating officer told him that Alison had survived the attack, and immediately all the blood drained from his face and he just looked shocked. Like he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that she had survived this attack. And after this, he just looked at the police officer and he's like, you know, I have nothing to say. She's already probably told you guys everything. And then he had a ring on his finger, so he took off the ring, gave it to the investigating officer, and told him that it belonged to Alison. And the ring still had blood, and this blood did belong to Alison. About 5 to 6 months after the attack, Alison had to undergo a psychological assessment, and the person assessing her thought that Alison wasn't angry enough about what had happened to her. A lot of people around her thought that she was coping really well, but then they then concluded that she was in a prolonged state of shock. If it wasn't enough for the police officers to want Alison to write down Franz and Dian's name and to also verbally say their names, she had to go through a police lineup where she identifies them. So apparently before this case, it wasn't like a one-way like mirror where you look at the perpetrators and you just read out the numbers, but they can't see you and you can see them. Before this, apparently all of you guys were literally in one room and you could see them and they could see you. So the investigating officer didn't want to put Alison through that. He didn't want her to be in the same room as these men. You know, they could like look at her, intimidate her, obviously like scare her. She was still scared for her life. So this was one of the first cases ever in South Africa where she identified them through like a one-way mirror, and it didn't take her that long. It took her a couple of seconds. She looked at them and she was like, number 6 and number 13, that's them. During the trial, Franz testified that he was a Satanist, and whilst he was in prison, apparently he had asked for a pastor to come and see him because he claimed that he was possessed and he had 2 demons inside of him, and these 2 demons had names. I forgot their names, but also I don't want to say their names, but you know, like those demonic names like you hear, you know, like those names, and they also had like their own personalities. But as they were interviewing him and asking him questions, he would often like confuse the 2 of them, even though they had like their own 2 names, own separate personalities. He would confuse them, and they looked at him and they were like, you're not going to get away with this. We know what you're trying to do. And 2 years after Franz and Diens had attacked Alison, his dad couldn't handle like the pressure, just knowing what his son had done. So he decided to commit suicide. Franz de Doit and Diens Kruger pled guilty to 8 charges, which included kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. And then on the 7th of August 1995, Franz de Doit was sentenced to 3 life terms with no parole, and Diens Kruger was sentenced to 1 life term and 25 years with no parole. The judge that sentenced them also wrote a special note that under no circumstances should they ever be released from prison because they are a danger to society. After the trial, Alison really struggled, not just physically but emotionally as well. She had to move in back with her mom, and you know, other people's lives around her continued, and for her it felt like her life was very stagnant at this point. Her mom had to look after her, help her bathe, and there was this one night where she decided that she was going to like bathe herself, and it was the first time she had really looked at her scars and what she had been through. And she remembered when the attack had happened, how she had this out-of-body experience and she had decided to choose life. And in that moment, she decided that she wasn't going to let Franz or Diens continue to have this control over her life. And she chose to continue with life again after that. She then wrote her first book and she started traveling all over the world, telling people about what had happened to her and how she overcame it. Not too long after that, Alison fell in love, and his name was Tshego Paledi, and they were friends before, but they had kind of lost contact and reconnected about a year after Alison's attack. And she said they had like some common interests, but the main one was just like both of them dealing with depression. Hers was her dealing with the attack that had happened to her, and Dini was him just dealing with unresolved childhood trauma. The two of them got married in February 1997, and despite all odds, Alison gave birth to their first boy in 2003 and another one in 2006. Unfortunately, their marriage didn't last, and Alison just said it's because things weren't the same, you know, just the little things that matter. And yeah, that is not the end of this case. We're almost done. In October 2015, Franz and Diens became eligible for parole, and this is because there was a new legislation that was passed in 2011 that said that people that had been sentenced for life imprisonment before 2004 would be eligible for parole if they had served 13 years and 4 months of their sentence. Alison found this out, and she was like scared and terrified that they would come out, and rightfully so. She also received an email from some lady in America claiming that her daughter, whose name is Sabrina, was Franz's fiance, and that they had been chatting and speaking on Facebook. This guy that is in prison for rape and attempted murder somehow had internet access, and he was on Facebook and other chat rooms. Alison heard this and she couldn't believe it, so she called the police up, told them about it, and just asked that they keep her statement anonymous. And they decided to give Franz her email address. Why would they do that? They literally gave this guy that tried to kill her email address. Sabrina later came out to say that her and Franz were no longer in a relationship, and this is because she had flown down from America to South Africa to visit him in prison, and while she was visiting him, she just noticed or found out that he was involved in illegal prison things, you know, and she was just scared for her life. Also, Franz had asked her for $10,000 so that he would be, like, that his parole application would go through and he would be released. In 2016, a movie about Alison's life titled Alison was released, and whilst they were filming, Franz contacted the filmmaker and he wanted an interview, and in return he wanted a letter of forgiveness from Alison that was signed. And the second thing is that he wanted profits from not only her book deals but her motivational speaking gigs. And he says this is because if it wasn't for him, she wouldn't have this success story. You know, like she wouldn't have all of these deals. And obviously his request was denied because, you know, I tried to find out if there was any more information about Franz de Doit and Dians Kruger's parole, but I haven't heard anything. So as far as I can tell, they are still in prison and they are still eligible for parole. You can find the movie Alison on Showmax. I'll put the link in the description box below, as well as the links to her 2 books. And that's it for today's case. I'm so interested to hear your guys' thoughts about this case, so please let me know down in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and all that jazz, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!